Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to part one of A Lamp Unto My Feet, A Light Unto My Path, a two-part series on Jewish Kabbalah for the Western esotericist. This title alludes to Psalms chapter 119, verse 105, and I borrow the phrase Jewish Kabbalah from the founder of the academic study of Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem. Our theme for winter is hidden light, which at first glance begs the question, if you have a light, why would you want to hide it? But further consideration reveals the hiding light actually provides it with a vehicle. Just as in Psalms 119, 105, the light is given a vehicle with the lamp. The tree of life on the left is what we may consider Jewish Kabbalah. This is an illustration from Chaim Vital's Es Chaim, and Vital was a student of Isaac Luria. And if we look at the tree of life, there's a lot to take in. But I'd like you to please direct your attention to the two hands at the bottom of the tree by the Sephirot of Malkuth. Now, if we look to the right, we'll see a tree of life that's an iteration from Western esotericism, or the order of the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn. So what we want to explore tonight is how can we understand the tree of life in Hermetic Kabbalah? And the best way to do that is to understand the tree of life in Jewish Kabbalah, because it's the Jewish Kabbalah that's the cornerstone of Western esotericism. Now, why is learning Kabbalah so overwhelming? It's overwhelming because we don't know how to navigate through this labyrinth of material that is available today. It's too easy to get lost, and it's too easy to run around in circles. And what is it about learning Kabbalah that's so disorienting? Well, it's disorienting because we don't know where or what time to begin. Kabbalah develops over centuries, and it has different countenances at different stages in history. And it's not immediately apparent what time period do we want to begin. John Fortune once wrote, "The mysticism of Israel, or Jewish Kabbalah, supplies the foundation of modern Western esotericism." She calls it occultism, or in other words, Hermetic Kabbalah, which forms the theoretical basis upon which all ceremonial is developed. So, in sum, to get Hermetic Kabbalah, we need to get Jewish Kabbalah. The challenge isn't necessarily that we don't know what to study, we just don't really know where to start. So what we really need is a methodology that's optimized for the Hermetic Kabbalist studying Jewish Kabbalah. Otherwise, we're subject to getting lost in this maze. The methodology that I propose this evening is an amalgamation from the last three generations of scholars in the academic field of Kabbalah. We start with Gershom Scholem, the founder of the academic study of Kabbalah, the author of the major trends in Jewish mysticism. And for Scholem, we need to be looking at specific events in historical context. For example, the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, the Spanish expulsion of Jews in 1492, and so on. So we're looking at specific events that happen in history. Contemporary to Scholem is Moshe Idel. And he argues we need to be looking at the countenance of Kabbalah. And it just so happens to develop in time when it does. And it's not necessarily predicated on that time in history. And that's a different way to see it. The current generation of Kabbalah scholars, represented by Boaz Huss, argues that our treatment of Kabbalah should be similar to our treatment of the humanities and the social sciences. So less concerned with what specifically happened in history, less concerned with what does it look like in the analytical category of mysticism, more concerned with what are these social and cultural formations that are happening when these major events in Kabbalah emerge. What's happening in Jewish history when we see the Sefer Yetzirah? What's happening in Jewish history when we see the Zohar, or the Bahir? What's happening? And that's his vantage point. So what I propose is that we take all three, we put them together, and we're going to use all three waypoints as we move forward. By the end of our time together, you'll be able to answer this question, well, what is Jewish Kabbalah? What does that even mean? Be able to answer that. You'll be introduced to key resources and authors. So if you want to go back and dive deep, jump down some rabbit holes, I have some sources for you to consider. You'll be introduced to the Hebrew Bible. What does that even mean? And you'll sketch the tree of life if you like to. You'll have the opportunity to do so. Let's define terms. We begin our journey by looking at the spherotic tree of life. But before we draw that, let's define what Kabbalah means. So Kabbalah in Hebrew means tradition. And for this talk, I'll be changing my inflection when I'm moving between Hermetic Kabbalah and Jewish Kabbalah. And that's just to help kind of delineate when I'm moving between the two traditions to avoid confusion. I've heard both expressions from both sides of the fence. So who's to say? Kabbalah is a speculative theology that emerges in Spain from between the 10th and the 13th centuries as part of the Sephardic cultural orbit that also includes Talmudic study, biblical exegesis, and philosophy. Jewish philosophy begins in the 10th century. There's no evidence before this, with the exception of Philo, who tries to synthesize scripture and philosophy in the Hellenistic times. But they will argue he was appropriated by the church fathers, and we won't spend too much time on Philo tonight, although he warrants hours and hours and hours of looking at it. Jewish theology becomes an investigation into rational speech and divine understanding. It explores the conflict between the dictates of reason and dogmas of religious faith. So as we consider the tree of life, let's look at it from a different angle. Less like, what is the mystical dimension of this? And let's consider it more as speculative theology. So we're looking at what is the difference between rational speech and divine understanding, and is one carry more weight than the other? In other words, the knowledge that I can gain through the empirical senses, does that knowledge somehow qualitatively value more than what we might call divine revelation? Right? In the Torah, there's knowledge that comes through dreams. So if I wake up and I have a dream and I interpret that dream from somebody, that's one particular type of knowledge. Is that kind of knowledge less valid than what I can prove in a scientific lab, or what I can prove with the reason? These are the questions that they're batting around. This is this kind of speculative theology. A big question for Jews at the time was, how can I be a reasonably, philosophically sound citizen of the world and reconcile dogmas of religious faith that conflict with rational thought? This is also a response to questions about cosmology. And cosmology is going to be a central question moving forward when we're looking at Kabbalistic texts and we're looking at the tree of life. In a Platonic worldview, God shapes the world out of eternal matter. We have Platonic metaphysics, which is to say that there are these instances that are predicated, that exist before creation, and they become realized and actualized in the mundane world as particulars. This becomes problematic for Judaism because in Judaism, God creates the world from nothing, ex nihilo, or yesh ma'in, as they say. So to suggest that there was something in existence before God creates the world goes against the central tenet of Judaism. So this becomes a problem for Jews living at the time who want to consider themselves, again, as metropolitan people of the world that are reading philosophy, understanding philosophy. But how do we sync this up? The tree of life is one answer to that particular question. How does God create the world? And does anything exist before God does that? And what is the relationship between God and creation and vice versa? This is one answer to that. Okay. The Sephirot. Sephirot is plural of the Sephirah, or Sephirot, or Sephirah, or Sphira, Sphirot. I've heard both. They're divine emanations that form the basis of creation. So this goes back to our question of cosmology. How is God creating the world? A root word of Sephirah is book, which is to suggest that each Sephirah can record information and acts like a memory bank, where a permanent record of everything that has ever taken place in creation, similar to the Akashic record. This is one aspect, the Sephirah, spirit. Another root word is communication. So Sphirot are the means through which God communicates with creation and vice versa. This is another function of these emanations. Lastly, number. The Hebrew word for number is a root word of Sephirah, spirit. So I saved this one for last because this is interesting. In Judaism, God is one. There's no plurality. There's monotheism as a central tenet. So how does God introduce plurality into a universe where he's the only thing that exists? He does it through the Sphirot. It's the Sphirot that introduce pluralism by way of 10 of them. Also, this facet of number will take us into a next topic of gematria, where each letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a numeric value. So before we move forward any further, let's go ahead and draw Sphirot. Draw the 10 out. You're welcome to join along with me if you like. But I think the best way to understand how this looks is just sketch out. Start at the top. So,
Very good. I can draw circles.
Yeah, do you want to draw?
Not at all.
I'll draw circles. Well, I don't. Okay.
Should we move the camera so that it's facing them?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So you'll stop sharing your screen.
Okay, so we'll start with the top three. We'll start with the top three and we're going to work our way in. It's going to understand how this whole thing is put together. So Josh, if you'd be so kind, we'll start with three, which is the same way we'd be looking at a triangle, 3 points of a triangle. Beautiful. Thank you, Josh. We start with three. We're going to come down. We're going to do the next two, which are going to be on the top side. So just one here.
Yeah. Circle. That's a meditative practice. Oh, wow. A little middle.
Right. That's
That's
two more. And then we got two more beneath there. Good. Okay, so this is something I think we've all seen before. I don't think this is shocking to anybody. We have the 10 Sphirot. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Now, a question. On a vertical axis, how many direct paths do we have in this diagram where we can connect two Sphirot directly? Josh, anybody disagree? Let's say. So we have one here, here, here. So on a vertical axis, on a vertical plane, there are three paths that we can connect Sphirot. So we're going to make a special note of that. On a horizontal plane, we have three paths. And this will become very important when we separate zero. We're looking at the three motor letters, the 7 doubles, and the 12 elementals. So the next question becomes, looking at the tree of life on the vertical axis, how many paths do we have that we can connect between Sphirot? Yeah, I guess it depends on how I look at it.
7?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, we'll start on this side. So here's here. Then moving down the middle. Whatever. Same ones.
Oh, because we're connecting twos, pairs. I see, okay. Yeah.
Cool. So 7 paths. 7 is important for a lot of reasons. One, 7 is introduced as a representative of the Sabbath. So 7 represents honoring the Sabbath, and it also represents, it's also a factor to argue about Enoch that we'll get back to in part 2. We'll give Metatron. So that'll be for next year. So we have vertical, and now we need to do diagonals. So I'm going to go in and fill the diagonals. And we want to take a stab at how many diagonals. More, yeah. Chris is right. Well, so keep notes. Here's one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you gonna? Yeah.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so the odd will come later. So the odd is unique because it essentially creates an 11th stroke. And so when we'll tackle that issue, but first we'll start with the 10, and then we'll get into the odd. I'm glad you brought that up too. And that's one reason why I used the sketch from Kaine's Hall, because in his diagram we don't have the odd yet. So that will come into play later. That's a big problem. So as we go through and connect. Do you mind if I hold your artistic skill? Yeah.
Just all the diagonals?
All diagonals. So we have 3 paths that are horizontal. We have 7 paths that are vertical and 12 that are diagonal. And this will come into play. This will become very important when we get into the Sefer Yetzirah and we get into Abraham Abalafi and we start to look at meditative techniques that have to deal with the Hebrew letters. Okay. Thank you, Josh.
You're welcome. No. Study service and meditation.
So let's talk about the tetragrammaton. This is something we see quite a bit, especially in Western Massachusetts. So on the screen, okay, Bob. Okay. So on the screen on the left, this is from some actual Jewish script. Hebrew reads from right to left in all caps. So we're looking at the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey. So what does this mean? We see it everywhere. It's all over Western esotericism. We see it in the tarot. We see it quite a few places. Here's another way to look at it. In Hebrew, this means the name of Hashem. Right? But it's also understood to be a verb. So it's not a noun. It has this unique capability. In Gematria, the Yud has a value of 10. The Hey has a value of 5. Vav has a value of 6. Of course, the Hey again has a value of 5. Okay. You say, well, okay, so what? 10 is representative of the 10 Sphirot that we just drew. These are the divine emanations through which God injects creative energy into the world, into creation. 5 represents the 5 fingers of the hand. Just pretend that's a hand.
Yeah, remember.
5 hand. Vav, value 6. Okay, what does 6 mean? What does that have to do? This is the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. And we also have up and down. Okay? So God is sending creative energy into the universe from the hand that gives the 6th direction, and this is the hand that receives. So to have a giver, we have to have a receiver. So if we remember in that first illustration that we had in the tree of life, from the Eschaim, there were two hands at the base of the tree of life. Okay, so this makes a little more sense of what are those hands doing at the bottom of the tree? One is to give, one is to receive. So the tetragrammaton, in this sense, is a verb. Rabbi Cooper would say that to be Yud-Hey Vav, Yud-Hey Vav Hey, creating. So anytime we're creating with an act of creation, we are using the tetragrammaton. So that's a little bit of gematria. Here's a little more. There's another meaning to the letter Hey. Aside from having a value of 5, it also means seed. Seed, to receive or to give seed. In the Hebrew Bible, Abram becomes Abraham after he receives the additional Hey, after he receives God's covenant. So he's not able to receive God's covenant until he has the hand that can receive, until he has the additional H. That's where we see that concept again. We see it with Sarai as well. So his wife Sarai is barren, unable to become pregnant by Abraham until Sarai's name is changed to what? Sarah. We see the H again. So there's the hand that receives, which also means seed. If you look at the illustration on the right, this is a penance or an amulet that was common in Jewish folklore at the time for people that wanted to become pregnant. They would wear the H in hopes that it would allow them, power them in some way to become pregnant, or protect them through a pregnancy. Okay, so I've mentioned the Hebrew Bible a couple of times. What am I talking about? What does Hebrew mean? Hebrew comes from the word Habiru or Apiru, which is a marginal semi-nomadic shepherd people. It's a social class. It's potentially the origin of the word Hebrew that we have. It's an ancient Near East language. And this is where we get the word Hebrew. Judaism is a religion of the book. Which book? The Tanakh. The Tanakh, which compromises the foundational sacred texts of the Jewish religion. It's the study and the commentary of these texts, which form the backbone of Kabbalah. Now, Tanakh is an acronym. So we take the T from Torah, which means law. It's also known as the Pentateuch. This is where we find the 613 commands. The Netuvim, which means the prophets. And this is the middle column. And then we have the Ketuvim, which is the writings. It's where we find Psalms and Proverbs. So the T, the N, and the K, we have Tanakh. So when we say Tanakh, what we're really talking about is the Hebrew Bible. Why divvy these books out in this way? Like, how is this helpful? Well, everything begins with the Torah. Everything begins with the revelation at Mount Sinai when Moses receives the commandments from God. The prophets are a way of helping understand, why did everything go wrong? Right? We had a covenant, we had the Exodus, we got out of Egypt, we got into the promised land, we had King David, we had King Solomon. Everything was going according to plan, everything was going splendidly until it wasn't. We lost everything. What happened? In come the prophets. They're going to help explain what happened. They're going to help us get back on the right track so we can get back to a good place. One last thing I want to say about the Tanakh is that it's meant to be read aloud. If we consider one of the most sacred prayers in Jewish history, the Shema, which is recited twice daily by observant practitioners, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, which means listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And what we want to take away from that is like the very, very first command is to listen, And that reminds me of Andrew's meditations in the morning, developing the inner listener. And lastly, the prayer is the Lord is one, and that reinforces the monotheism that we will find and that we'll have to reinforce when we're looking at the cosmologic aspect of the tree of life. Okay, timeline of Jewish history. Now, don't worry, we're not going to go over all of this tonight. Maybe we won't. So what we want to do is we want to go from where does this whole thing start? Where does the story begin? Who's the very first Jew? Genesis names Abraham the Hebrew as a Mesopotamian who migrated to Canaan in obedience to a man from God. Mesopotamia, of course, is present-day Iraq and eastern Syria. Now, we already have an amazing presentation on the Theosophical Society YouTube about Kabbalah and the chakras by Sue. And it brings us all the way to Isaac Luria. She's already covered this splendidly. So what we will do is we're just going to move up to where we see Isaac Luria. And the reason we do that is because Sue has already covered everything. There's no need to do that again. Thank you for being here. So we'll start 2,000 years BCE, before the Common Era. Okay, 2,000 years, roughly. This is where we see Abraham. So again, Genesis names Abraham. He's the Hebrew, as the Mesopotamian who migrated to Canaan in obedience to a command from God. And then we roughly estimate the Israelites were in slavery between 200 and 400 years. The Exodus from Egypt, circa 1200 before the Common Era. From the end of the 13th century to the end of the 11th century BCE, for 200 years, the Israelites were organized in Canaan as a confederation of 12 tribes. The golden age of Jewish history is the approximately 80 years of King David's reign and that of his son Solomon combined, that figure in the Jewish imagination throughout the centuries. When we talk about Solomon's temple, what we're talking about is the son of King David from this time frame. After Solomon's death, the kingdom fractured into two states, Judah and Benjamin, and the northern tribes. The northern kingdom of Israel survived for 200 years, but was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. The first temple is destroyed in 587 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, and this is our first Babylonian exile. It is from this period that it becomes appropriate to begin speaking of the Jewish people. And it's interesting to note that we've essentially become full circle. We start with Abraham, moving out of Mesopotamia, and here we are in 587 BC, exiled back to where it all began. The prophet Ezekiel is living during this time of Babylonian exile, where he has the vision of the cherubim, the Ophanim, and the divine chariot. The vision of the chariot, which is very prominent in Western esotericism, is historically located in the 6th century, or 600 years before Jesus of Nazareth is born. And it's taking place in Iraq. That's just a really interesting contextual piece of information when we talk about the vision of Ezekiel, right? Well, what's going on with this guy? He sees a chariot in the sky, thoughts on the wheels and the eyes. What's happening? Well, what's happening is 600 years before Christ is born, he's living in Iraq, the first Babylonian exile. That's what's happening. In 538 to 539 BCE, soon after, let me take one step back. So this concludes the First Temple period. So this is a phrase we hear quite often, First Temple this, First Temple that. Okay, but what does that actually mean? This is what we're talking about. These are the events, as Gershom Scholem would identify. These are specific events in history, the destruction of the temple, the Babylonian exile. This is what's driving Kabbalah. Okay? This First Temple period really leaves a scar in the collective Jewish psyche. This is something that really has an impact on everything to come after. In the Second Temple period, in 538 to 539 BCE, soon after conquering Babylon, Cyrus orders the restoration of the Judean community in the newly established Persian province of Judea. Now, this is fascinating. It is the Babylonians Ezra returns to Judea from Babylonia, bringing the Torah and reading it to the people for the very first time in 458 BCE, and helps facilitate the building of the Second Temple in 515 BCE, which means a couple of interesting things. The funding and the project to rebuild the Second Temple, that wasn't something that happened insularly in Canaan, in the Promised Land. That happened in the area of Babylon. And the Persians came back and said, we want you to rebuild the temple. We're going to help you do it. And we're going to pay for it. They rebuilt it. And that window between the destruction of the first temple and the building of the second temple is narrow enough that there very well could have been people that were alive at the destruction of the first temple that were still alive when the second temple came back. Alexander the Great attacks the Persian Empire in 334 BCE, and he conquers the entire known world by 333 BCE, which introduces Greek Hellenism into the world, where we have the introduction and rise of Hellenic Judaism for 300 years. And then the Romans come. So William has already talked about the influence of Plato and Platonic metaphysics when it comes to Hermetic Kabbalah, so we won't go too far into that unique part of history, but I do want to illustrate one thing about that time period. I mentioned Philo earlier. I'm going to come back to him now. And the reason he's interesting to us is because a lot of scholars consider him the father of modern Western mysticism. With Philo, he was the first one to try to marry Greek philosophy and Judaism. Right? He's the very first guy to do this. And one way he does that is he's looking for the number 7 in Greek literature. So he's looking through the Iliad and the Odyssey. He sees Odysseus and he's like, well, this looks a lot like Moses. In fact, I think Moses is a philosopher. We call him a prophet, but he's actually a philosopher king. These two systems are one and the same. One and the same. This was revolutionary. I mentioned Enoch earlier. Enoch was a great-grandparent of Noah. This is before the flood. He lived for 365 years. He walked with God for 300 years, whatever that means.
Yeah, what's that mean?
What does that mean? Very next. And it gets better. He walks about 300 years, and he doesn't die because God takes him up into heaven, and he tells him, "I'm going to take you up into heaven in 7 days." Okay, so now he has 7 days that he knows before he's going to get taken up into heaven by God, and everybody's rushing out to talk to him because he was the wisest man alive at the time. So 365, that sounds an awful lot like the 365 days in the solar calendar, 7 days in a week. This is kind of compelling, right? So what are they getting at? They're suggesting that Enoch is a solar deity that he's introducing the solar calendar, or it's primarily a lunar calendar at the time. Maybe. But Philo comes in and he takes a look at this and he sees the number 7. He's looking for 7s everywhere. For him, 7 is not only is it 7 days of a week, it represents one revolution of a week. So 7 days is a completion. So we're looking again at Philo, and here's where it gets really interesting. This is Philo again. If Enoch is walking with God for 300 years, he's still righteous. What does that mean about the other 65 years? Right? So that means for 65 years, Enoch wasn't walking with God. So how does that make sense? So for 65 years, he's not walking with God. Something happens after this 65th year. He walks with God for 300 years, and then he's taken up into heaven. Right? Philo is going to say, well, Enoch repented. That's what the 7 means. It means he came full circle himself, error his ways, repented, and then he's taken up in heaven. So what's really important is not necessarily so much what are the numbers in the event. The really important thing is just this mindset that he introduces. So we're looking at things, I mentioned earlier that Kabbalah is speculative theology. And this is one example of that speculative theology. We're speculating. How is this working? Why is that happening that way? One last thing in the Second Temple period, the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh is finalized in 150 BCE to 100 CE. The Jewish-Roman War ends with the fall of Jerusalem, who destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE. Second Temple goes down. Judaism becomes a diasporic religion, which means there's no temple in the 1st and 2nd century BCE. Now, how could such an identity be maintained in the absence of a common political framework, a common language, or national institutions? And this is a very, very compelling question, because this really shapes these cultural formations that Boaz Huss is talking about. For Huss, it's these cultural formations that shape in Kabbalah, not necessarily these specific events in history. It's the fact that we're living in the diaspora. Foundational commentaries on sacred Jewish texts are completed and become foundations of the Talmud. In the 3rd century, the Mishnah is redacted by Judah Hanazi in the land of Israel, and what's otherwise known as the Oral Torah. There's this idea that there's a Torah, there's a law that's written down, but there's also an oral Torah that's spoken. And scholars will point to the fact that Moses and the Israelites were wandering in the wild for a long time, 40 years. That's a long time to be wandering out. What were they doing in the meantime? And a lot of scholars will argue, well, Moses was learning an oral Torah and passing it on and on and on through the generations. Had Judah Hanazi not redacted the oral Torah, there's a good chance that it may have been lost to history forever. So Judah Hanazi is a little bit of a hero in that lens. The Talmudic academies, we have a Talmud that emerges from Jerusalem in 380 and 499 Babylon. It is the Babylonian Talmud that is considered the main Talmud that is studied in schools today, as referred, and is essentially commentary on commentary on commentary on commentary. Going back to Gershom Scholem, in his initial investigations of Kabbalah, was one methodology he uses. Well, when did people start talking about Kabbalah in these commentaries, right? So if we were investigators, we wanted to go back in time and figure out, when did this particular idea come about? And we had access to, say, somebody's Slack. We could go in and we could read all the commentaries, right? And we could determine at what point in time did this idea become introduced. And we could also understand, how is the narrative framed for what they were talking about, which also becomes important. The main subject taught in the academies in Baghdad was religious law. In the 7th to 11th centuries, known as the Gaonic period for Jewish history. Aramaic was the common language during Roman times. And the Babylonian Talmud is written in Aramaic, as well as the Zohar. We have to mention a few people alive during this time. Saadia Gaon, from 882 to 942, was an intellectual giant. And some say he was a type of Philo, following Philo. He lived a good part of his life in Iraq. He wrote the Book of Beliefs and Opinions in a step towards orthodoxy. At this time, he was fighting this group or the sect called the Karaites, who rejected rabbinic authority and says, no, the oral law is no good. No good. We just want the written law. Keep the oral law. for yourselves. And so there was a battle of orthodoxy that was happening at the time. And why the Karaites are important is because this is the group that introduces the idea of vowel signs into the Hebrew alphabet. And before the Karaites, there were none. There are no vowels in the Hebrew language until the Karaites come along. That becomes helpful when we're trying to date specific texts. When we get to the Bahir, there's commentary about what do some of the vowel signs mean. And in the Sefer Yetzirah, there are none. So that kind of helps give us an idea of what time period are these texts coming out of. Into the Middle Ages, Rabbi Solomon Isaac, or the Rashi, from 1040 to 1105, writes a commentary on almost the entire Tanakh of the Hebrew Bible and Talmud, which has no peer from the Arab-speaking world and which remains an indispensable tool of Talmud study until our own day. In fact, he has his own script called the Rashi script. One of the Cordovan Jewish families that fled persecution during a time was that of a judge named Maimon, whose son Maimonides, from 1138 to 1204, became the most famous Jew of the Islamic age. He was considered to be the Da Vinci of his time. And Maimonides writes the Guide for the Perplexed, which is committed to this idea that nothing in scripture can contradict what we know with reason. It was a radical thought at the time. If we can't sync this up with reason, we shouldn't accept it. And this will be echoed later with Spinoza a few centuries later. In 1250 to 1305, we see Moses de Leon of Spain publishes the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah. The 2nd century CE esoteric interpretations of the Torah by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his disciples. And this begins the evolution of modern Kabbalah, or esoteric Judaism. And the Zohar is to Kabbalah what the Talmud is to Judaism. For the originator of the analytical category of Jewish mysticism, Martin Buber, the Sefer Yetzirah is the oldest mystical book in Jewish mysticism, which he dates to between the 7th and 9th centuries. Common Era, nobody really knows for sure, but we do know when the Karaites came on the scene, so we can safely assume it happened before them. We see the Zohar in the 13th century, and it's this 400 to 600 year time period that becomes the incubation period for Kabbalah, which erupts following the Spanish expulsion of Jews in the late 15th century and finds new expression in the Messianic Kabbalah of Isaac Luria. And that is where we will wrap up our historical journey. So in conclusion, going back to where we started with the methodology about moving through this history and why in the world would we want to go through this world history? What does this have to do with Kabbalah? Well, we reviewed the key events, the destruction of the first temple, Ezra returning from Babylon, the second temple and destruction of the second temple, Spanish expulsion of Jews in 1492. We looked at social and cultural formations. Judaism become a religion in diaspora. What does it mean to live in exile? And how do we reconcile the events of having to live in diaspora? And then returning again to Jewish mysticism, we're looking at speculative theology. So Kabbalah doesn't become mysticism until the middle of the 19th century. Really prior to that, it's speculative theology. And this is kind of where we started our journey. And so we'll come right back. So now that we have a little better understanding of the arc of this history between Abraham and his journey from Mesopotamia to the introduction of Lurianic Kabbalah, we take a look at the tree of life and start to consider some of these questions. So how does God create the world? How does God introduce creative energy into the world? For the Kabbalists, they will say it's the 10 Spirot. These are divine emanations that introduce creation into the world, right? Abraham Abulafia made a comment one time that the Christians have the Trinity, but we have 10. I'm taking a stab at like, how do you reconcile monotheism, 10 Spirot? Well, it's the Spirot that introduce plurality in the universe. It's not God. There's also a question of how does God interact with creation and the universe and vice versa. And so I know you mentioned this in your presentation on the Tikkun Olam. healing the world. And this is really a revolutionary idea that comes from Lurie, is that we become co-creators, co-partners in creation with God. So we are helping God by healing the world through Tikkun Olam, which is going to ruffle some feathers on the other side of the house, because they will say, how can you suggest that the actions of God are predicated on the actions of man? This is blasphemy. So back and forth, and the conversation goes on. Okay, so that's a lot for a Sunday night. So we covered roughly 3,500 years of ancient Near East history, a little bit of Judaism, some Jewish philosophy, a little bit of the Kabbalah. There's a second part to this program, and this first part is a lead up to the second part. When we get to the second part, we're going to really get into the 32 mystical paths of wisdom engraved by Yah. We're going to really get into the Sefer Yetzirah. We're going to look at the three mother letters and how the Tetragrammaton emerges from these three mother letters. Here is a sneak peek of what we're going to start to look at. You may be thinking, oh my gosh, now why are you doing this to me? I just wanted to learn about a lot. This is why. So one example, going back to the Tetragrammaton, in the Sefer Yetzirah, there's a suggestion that we're really looking at three letters initially with Yud Hey Vav. And it's a little counterintuitive to see a letter that repeats itself in the name of God, for God that is monotheistic. And it feels a little redundant. What is this about? Why do we need two of the same letter to express monotheistic deity? In the Sefer Yetzirah, they will argue that prior to the creation of the universe, it was the Aleph, the Mem, and the Shin. Roughly, the Aleph, the Mem, and the Shin that the Tetragrammaton emerged from. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense if we don't get into the gematria of the Yud Hey Vav Hey. So if we look at the total gematria value of the Yud Hey Vav Hey, anybody remember?
36.
10, 5, 6.
21, 31.
I don't know. Okay. So the Tetragrammaton has a geometric value of 26. Kabbalistically speaking, when we look into the text, things that are numerically identical have identical values. So if you look at the Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Zion, it has a value of 1. But what we can do is we can take the Aleph, we can separate it out into, we pull this view this way, this view that way, we brought view, and we also get 26. And so there will be Kabbalists that are going to look at the Aleph as kind of the mother of the Tetragrammaton. And that's not going to make sense if we don't cover that stuff first. Josh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone for hanging out on a Sunday night, going over ancient Near East world history, Jewish esoteric philosophy, just the kind of light reading to wrap up the week that everybody likes. I know we're out of time for questions, but if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to write them down. And if you want to meet again next year, we can take a look at it that we didn't have time to answer tonight. Yes, sir.
Bill has a quick question.
Yes, Bill.
Yeah, first, thank you very much for this highly informative presentation. Thank you.
My pleasure, Bill.
So the first question that I have is, you had mentioned early on a dilemma between traditional Jewish thinking that God made everything out of nothing, if I understood right. So what is the other point of view or the dilemma?
Great question, Bill. Thank you. So if I'm understanding you correctly, the question is, what is the discussion that's taking place between the dilemma of the universe being created out of nothing.
Yes.
So in Judaism, the universe is created ex nihilo, which means out of nothing, which also suggests nothing pre-existed the creation of the universe. To suggest otherwise would be to somehow reduce the power of God's creative capacity. So it becomes very important. With an Aristotelian metaphysic of the world is eternal. Everything that we see now has always been and it will always will be. Everything is eternal. That becomes pretty glaringly difficult for the for Judaism to digest. Platonic metaphysics gets a little bit closer. It's a little bit closer, where we start to talk about emanations, instances, and particulars, where these there are instances in the universe and they realize here in the physical world, but there's a pre-existence of a thing that becomes realized. And so that is going to be a real problem for this idea of creating the universe from nothing. And that's a little bit of what's driving this dilemma of cosmology. So how did God create? How did the world come into being? That is really a big question that's driving a lot of the commentary that we'll be seeing in the Kabbalistic material.
Thank you. One other question. This is more of an aside. I saw on one of your charts that you mentioned the Khazars,
Yeah.
and that's a very mysterious group. I've never been able to find any hard information on this group. Are you aware of a history, who these people were? I mean, there's one story that this was a tribe that lived near the Caspian Sea that adopted Judaism. That's just one story. Anyway, would you happen to know more about that?
That's another great question. That is a fierce debate. What I can tell you that I'm aware of is right now there's a little bit of like DNA investigation that's taking place. Like the same thing that we see in Ethiopia, where there are claims that the 10 lost tribes actually migrated to Ethiopia. And so they're looking for DNA evidence to link people that are existing down there making that claim to making genealogical arguments. I know that there are similar arguments with the Khazaris. My understanding is that the scholarship is very divided on the Khazaris. Some scholars will say it never happened, they never existed, they never converted, and you'll see everything on the other side. I don't have scholarly resources available right now on the Khazaris, but I am more than happy to put a list together. And I'm more than happy to reach out to some of my professors and some of my friends that are scholars in the field that deal with that particular time in history.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your questions, Bill.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Matt. We will see you again in January 12th, I believe. In the interim time, we will be having on January 3rd a Kabbalah Shabbat dinner. And that's a Friday evening, so that might be a lovely chance to experience some of the mystical sides of practice. So yeah.
Thank you, Josh.
Cool. January 3rd. January 3rd. Should be a Friday evening.
Thank you so much, Matt. This was wonderful. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. Thanks for spending your Sunday night with us.